Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. In this episode, I would try to highlight some questions about creation and this question of a beginning and an end. And in the last episode, Cameron talked about God as the creator of the universe. But is this something all religions are united around? Or is there any alternative understanding of what is and what is not? Parmenides, a Greek philosopher, argued that something that exists can't be made out of nothing, and what exists cannot return to nothing. The logical consequence of this thought is that what has always been and will always be only change in different forms and existence. The beginning of Big Bang was first expressed by a priest. This metaphor is embraced by natural science, but are science able to reveal what is before the Big Bang? And if there was some kind of superpower that created the Bang, as Pope Francis stated in 2014, he says, the theory of evolution and the Big Bang are real, and God is not a magician with a magic wand. The Big Bang, which today we hold to be the origin of the world, does not contradict the intervention of the divine creator, but rather requires it. Evolution in nature is not inconsistent with the notion of creation, because evolution requires the creation of beings that evolve. So is Big Bang the creation of everything, or just our universe? Is it the beginning? If what is eternal, I guess the universe are not finite, and idea of an everlasting universe is quite mind-blowing. I would say that something that exists will always exist. My dear mother passed away, and we had a nice funeral. I wrote memorial words. She believed in a soul that made her into the woman she was, and which was not changeable. It was she. If this soul is part of what exists, it must still exist. Maybe not as her form, but still exist. This was just my thoughts on creation and the beginning and the end. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on my beginning?
That's a beautiful starting point for a number of possible different conversations. And I'm not sure where to start, or what would be like the most fruitful line to go from here. We can talk about the Big Bang and what modern cosmology says about the Big Bang, whether it's really the beginning or not. We can talk about the nature of the soul. Where does the soul come from? Where is it going? We don't know. I think in the end we have to take a standpoint of epistemological humility about these big questions and realize that we don't have the physical evidence to conclusively say this is the right way to think about origins and endings and so forth, which isn't to say that we should give up on the project, but that as we continue to gather evidence, as we continue to refine our models, we should always be aware that the smallest discrepancy in our models may open a door to major changes in our interpretation. And that ultimately then what we're always left with are just models that are hopefully increasingly accurate approximations of whatever that ultimate reality is. The Big Bang and this question of cosmic origins is a perfect example of that, because as you pointed out, this theory of the Big Bang, which was first perhaps proposed by a priest,
I
and
think it
which
was
could be
called, his name was George Lemaitre.
George Lemaitre, yes, could be interpreted as confirmation of certain religiously motivated cosmological ideas, like the idea of the creation, in 6 days, as described in the book of Genesis. It seems to line up very nicely with that idea. Well, there is a starting point to everything, but we don't know whether that starting point is really the starting point of everything, or whether, as you also alluded, maybe there are other bangs. Yeah, maybe there are either in parallel with this or preceding this and following this. And we can go in lots of different directions and say, well, there were previous universes and everything is cyclical, or we can think of it as like bubbles in a glass of champagne, and there can be millions of these all bubbling at the same time. And there are physical theories that propose all of these different possibilities, as well as a physical theory which proposes that ultimately there is no before the Big Bang, that time and space themselves came into existence at the moment of the Big Bang. So it's even useless to ask, well, what happened before? So we can think of several different possible, completely different explanations about the cosmos, which are all consistent with the available evidence. And the available evidence, which is of such astonishing precision, and which is getting more and more astonishingly precise as we launch satellites into space, as we find better and better ways of gathering light from distant stars and galaxies. But still, the question of ultimate origins is unresolved by these increasingly precise observations. And we're still left ultimately kind of to our own metaphysical devices in deciding what we would like to believe about ultimate origins. Is time extruded along a timeline where we can identify a starting point and maybe or maybe not an end point? Is time wrapped up in itself in more of a circle, in which there are grand cycles that repeat themselves? Is time not a single line, but multiple lines, and we just happen to be on one of these lines? In the case of something like a multiverse, which is currently a fashionable idea. I think, given the fact that we don't have the data to conclusively, winnow out the true theories from the false theories, what is our best standpoint? What's the right sort of position to take? And I imagine one way to think about the right position to take is something that Carl Sagan said, actually. he said that at the heart of science is an essential balance between two seemingly contradictory attitudes, an openness to new ideas, no matter how bizarre or counterintuitive they may be, and the most ruthless skeptical scrutiny of all ideas, old and new. This is how deep truths are winnowed from deep nonsense. And as Sagan describes this attitude of the scientist, which is somehow open and skeptical at the same time, I wonder how fruitfully we might consider applying that same dual attitudes towards religious ideas.
Mm. And if I may just continue in a slightly different sort of path of thought, because the concept of creation that you mentioned, Knut Ove, I think I mean, okay, so what is created sort of proceeds, as it were, from the creator, but that relationship is not necessarily just one of time. It is maybe one of, how would I say, primacy, because let's say that there is a being that can make a noise, and so from the very first moment that that being exists, it makes a noise. Now the being and the noise would be time-wise sort of simultaneously in existence. It's just that it's not that one precedes the other, but one proceeds from the other. So the sound comes from that being that makes the sound. So I think that I mean, this thing that you said about the Greek philosopher, yes, it makes sense. I mean, if there is some such thing as we call God, something that has eternally existed, and so obviously God would be unchangeable in his nature. So for instance, he's always been a creator. Now that means that if God has eternally been a creator, that would logically mean that there should have eternally also been a creation. So it can't be that God was having a good time by himself, for a few million years, and then he thought, this is boring. Let's create some company or something like that. So
if I understand you correctly, Cameron, because something actually does exist, there must be also some kind of something that have brought existence into existence.
Well, yes, I mean, of course, this sort of leads us also. I mean, I know that the kind of question that this can bring about is that, okay, so if God created the creation, then who created God? I mean, so I think there are. I think the concept of God includes the idea that he's the sort of the first or primary cause for everything. But I mean, I'm just trying to address the issue of time here, that from the point of view of, I mean, if we assume that there is this kind of an eternally existing and unchangeable creator that in religious terminology is referred to as God, then it would seem logical that creation must also be eternal. I mean, a creator without a creation is not possible. And since God is a creator, and as God is unchangeable, it's not like he was young for a time and then he became a creator or something like that. But so he's been a creator eternally, will eternally be a creator. Thereby, also creation in some form has to be eternal as well. So in that sense, I think it's not a matter of one preceding each other, one preceding the other in time. It's just one preceding the other in how would I say, in
Causality?
causality. Exactly. Yes, one is the cause of the other. Yeah.
I,
But I don't know
I,
if that makes sense.
because I've you know, when you get closer to death and you really start to think about what does what is existence and what is this all about, and then I started to think that maybe a life is like a universe, that we do have a beginning everybody has a beginning, and we also has an end. So we have, it's like a big bang in the beginning that creates a human being, and it, with death we have like another big bang, another exchange of forms. And then, of course, this question, if there is some kind of this a soul or something that is me or my mother, then okay, so is there something that still exists that could be called her, or could it be something totally different? Could it be that our soul changes forms into a totally different kind of existence?
That's very good.
In the spirit of half of Carl Sagan's statement about being intensely skeptical about our existing ideas, the history of science shows us over and over how our clear intuitions of how the world works are can often be completely wrong. You know, we all know intuitively how our vision can deceive us when we look at a mirage, just as one of 1,000 possible examples. And that fallibility of our intuitions, I think, runs so deep. It runs to our very notion of causality. And I think this partly explains how philosophers over thousands of years have never managed, and theologians have never managed to figure out what's the right way to think about causality. We can go all the way back to Aristotle, who tries to argue every effect has a cause, and then inserts the claim an infinite chain of causes and effects is out of the question. So therefore, there must be an uncaused cause. That kind of argument and the counter arguments and the counter arguments and so forth that follow throughout the history of philosophy are all, I think, based upon a certain intuition that we have about causality. That causality is some sort of force or some sort of, there has to be an efficient cause to every effect. There has to be something that makes something happen. And I think one thing that this leaves out is the possibility of self-causation, which didn't seem to be seriously considered by the ancient Greeks. It's been considered from time to time by different philosophers and theologians. It seems to me to be a neat, possible, different pathway to think about beginnings and endings, that a cause or an effect can somehow be its own cause. So I think that's one way in which we should at some point be willing to let go of our intuitions about how the world is to explore different possibilities. A separate way I would think that we might try to loosen a bit our hold on what we think our hold on reality is our intuition of separateness, the intuition that I'm separate from you, that and that souls are separate entities fundamentally, almost in some sort of atomic sense, like you have separate atoms of oxygen, floating around in the room in front of me that I can't see. I think for historical reasons, in part, we think of souls in a similar sort of a sense. They have some beginning we don't quite understand, but we would like to assign a certain moment in time where they come into existence. But then we think of them as these atomic entities that continue on, infinitely far into the future with their own unique personalities and memories and associations and so forth. Perhaps that intuition about the nature of soul also is something which we might let go of or try to let go of as we explore and as we try to model reality. And for that, we can look at other religious traditions and other philosophies that have conjectured or maybe asserted, without proof, as all of these ideas are without proof, that the separateness that we experience and the separateness that we assume is in some way an illusion, in some way maybe a surface level manifestation of something which at its roots is all connected. So that maybe the separateness of the soul, then, when we try to imagine the beginnings and endings of souls, the beginning and ending of a life, perhaps obviously in some physical sense, because we can assign a moment of birth and a moment of death, there's some reality to that. But perhaps the consciousness which animates the body is in some way not truly separate from other consciousnesses. Perhaps in some way it's somewhat like a ray of the sun. You can, under certain circumstances, like in certain photographic conditions, capture what seems to be different rays of the sun, as they traverse the mist or shine through a tree or something like that. But how separate is the ray from the sun? That analogy only goes so far, because, well, what if the rays return to the sun? What if the movement of creation is a sort of precession and return, like Plotinus, and the idea of emanation and return? And the idea of rays from the sun doesn't capture that second half of the movement. So maybe it's more like magnetic field lines. They proceed from one pole, but they return back to the same source at some point. Perhaps consciousness is similar to that. And perhaps that gives us a different way of thinking about beginnings and endings, a different way of thinking about our relationship to loved ones who have passed on. Perhaps we're not really separate from them.
I think that your argumentation would fit with Parmenides. I know that he didn't believe in causality. That he would say that what exists exists, and what does not exist does not exist. And also this idea about atoms, or that we are separated. He would say that we are one. And then we are back in one of the earlier podcast episode when we talked about one or many, or plurality. Yeah. But one thought that I'm not sure of, that was the beginning when you talked about Carl Sagan and our intuition, because I follow you that many of our intuition we should be skeptical towards, but I think that there are also intuitions in human being that are very often correct. And I think we often, when we have one or two examples of intuitions that doesn't give the correct or are wrong, then we say, okay, intuitions, that is not something that we should follow. And my example that I often use is this example with if someone is crying, then most people have the same notion, the same intuition, that they should try to care for the person that is crying. And I don't think that we need a kind of knowledge or a kind of whatever, learn something to do this. I think that this is part of our intuition, but it's maybe a different intuition than causality. And I also think that these kind of intuitions are something that is extremely important, and maybe they are also something that proves our connectedness and not our separation from other beings. That we are actually able to understand the feeling, or even feel pain when other people feel pain.
That's a great point. I guess it begs the question, under what circumstances should we implicitly trust our intuitions? Given, sometimes our intuitions lead us in the wrong direction, like our intuition about self versus other, our intuitions that often put others in a separate category, and ourselves and our tribe in a certain privileged category. Those are some of the strongest human intuitions that are out there, that we're trying to to fight against in this day. But are there other intuitions in which we should place implicit confidence, like the intuition of love and care for others, the intuition of empathy towards the suffering, the intuition which seems at times so clearly contradictory to our lived experience that things can be separated into chunks, into parts that all have their own trajectories in space and time. That's our clear intuition of the universe, but sometimes that's our clear experience of the universe, but sometimes our intuition of things is that there's this deeper connection and oneness, particularly between human beings, particularly between members of a certain category, in this case, the human species. Can we say as a general rule that we should follow the intuitions of love wherever they lead? That's, I guess, an open question.
But it's also very easy to answer.
I think so.
Yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think you just made this. You brought a completely new, a very important but new sort of dimension to this. The concept of love, what is really love, and uh, I can just say that I think that most of human mistakes are actually because of wrongly intuited love rather than misplaced hatred there. But I think another I just going back to what Knutuba took up originally, and especially in connection with his dear mom. I mean, I think one of the intuitions, of course, that we have is the intuition of our own existence, that we actually exist, that we are real. And like, there have been all these thought experiments about, like, maybe I don't exist. I'm just, somebody's playing some sort of a game or something like that. And I think I exist. I'm just somebody's, I don't know, somebody's projection of their thoughts or something. And but I think that even if we leave that question alone, uh, when I experience my own self, because I think we all have quite a strong experience of our own selves, quite regardless of what our level of education is or what knowledge we have. I mean, we experience our own existence. But then who is that me actually? I mean, is it my face? Is it my personality? Or is there something even beyond that? Uh, and I don't know if you've seen this. I'm trying to think what the name of this film was, but there was an American, it was sort of a comedy about this. I think he was an American football player or some sort of a sportsman who got hit by a car and died. Oh, yes, it's called Heaven Can Wait. Have you seen that film? Okay, the story is this. So this guy gets hit by a car, he dies, he goes to heaven, and then the angel there says, "Oh my goodness, there's been a mistake. You were not supposed to die yet. So you have to go back to earth. But now the problem is that your body has been destroyed by this car. So we have to put you in another body." So he sort of goes back to earth, but he doesn't look the same as before. And now he has this great challenge of trying to come in contact with people that he loved and who loved him. But of course, nobody recognizes him because he looks completely different. And it's very interesting how he um, manages to convince some of these people that he's actually him without looking like what he used to look like. And I think there the question comes in. And sometimes I wonder that, like, if we had to meet each other in some sort of a space or universe where we would not have our bodies, and it would be something of our essence, like our somehow our human qualities or our thoughts or whatever, would we recognize each other, or how would we recognize each other?
And to up the ante, what if we didn't have any specific memories either? Because then that's kind of an
Yeah.
easy thing. Oh, do you remember meeting me at this place or
Yes,
this we
exactly,
did
exactly.
together?
Yeah, yeah, that you
If you
cannot
strip that away
refer
as
to. Yes,
well,
exactly,
if you assume
exactly.
that that's not part of who we are essentially, then
Yes,
it's
yes.
something deeper than that.
Yeah, exactly.
How would we recognize each other?
Yeah.
What people who we think we know do we actually not know at all? We've just had
Yes, yes,
some physical
exactly.
experiences on this planet together. And what
Yes.
people who we thought we didn't know at all were actual close, you know, closely affiliated with.
I know sometimes when you like when you have kids and you look at your kids when they suddenly they're walking in a special way or they are behaving in special. It's not what they are doing, but the way they are doing it.
Mm, mm,
And so if this is something that is you are able to recognize people not by their faces or by their behavior, but actually by their way of being,
mm,
then maybe it should be possible, even though he has changed his body, or to actually
mm,
to recognize someone
mm, mm.
without. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
believe
it's
that's the
this,
thing.
yeah, 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 it's a, yeah. But then, you think also that, okay, like there can be several people who have at least a certain, how would say, combination of human qualities. And how do you tell them apart? Like uh, a number of very kind and forgiving people, who's who among them. So, yeah, I
Maybe
don't
in
know.
the
I mean,
metaphysical realm, it's not as important to distinguish.
yeah,
It-
exactly.
Maybe in that realm beyond time and space, in that realm beyond this human life, it's not as important to consider that this drop is separate from that drop. If as the metaphor goes, the drops, merge with the sea, and so nothing of their essence is lost. Only the boundary of the drop, which is ephemeral and a function of time and place. Then we meet at the sea.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought. So is what you're saying like okay, so I mean, let's say I have loved my mother very much for the kind of person she was. And if there is an existence beyond this world and we move on to that, then it's not so much that I encounter some separate entity that is my mom, but rather that I experience all those good things that I loved in my mom.
Mm. I was connected to that. I was listening to a talk by Karen Armstrong, and she
Yeah.
made a point about the afterlife,
Mm,
which which I thought was pretty profound. She said
mm,
that that religion is meant to be about the abandonment of our ego,
mm,
not its eternal survival in optimum
mm.
conditions. I
That's a
think
good statement. That's a good statement.
it's a great pithy way
Mm,
of summing up how I think how so many people think about the afterlife, which is
mm, mm,
optimal survival of this ego with my memories, my
mm,
personality, all of
mm,
this
mm,
stuff in this package that somehow has this eternal existence. But if you look at the wisdom of the ages, of how the saints and the mystics describe the spiritual path, it's not about maintaining that perfect boundary between the ego and everything
mm,
else. It's about the dissolution of the boundaries of that
mm,
ego, sort
mm,
of merging
mm,
in a way with the with the spirit of the universe, from which one came and to which one returns. Just as the
mm.
metaphor of the drop, which comes
Yeah.
from the ocean and returns to the ocean. But it also seems like kind of a dangerous idea in a way. It's an idea which its time has to come into the heart, because otherwise one feels perhaps that the motivation to do something in the world might be withdrawn if there isn't some eternal consequence to me, this drop, named Stephen, that if there isn't some eternal consequence, good or bad, for my actions in this world, then why would I bother to do anything? I think ultimately that's a very limited way of thinking about the spiritual path in terms of eternal rewards and eternal punishments. But perhaps it is at the same time an essential component for a great part of humanity to think in that way throughout history. I mean, perhaps not everyone is going to get to the point of realizing the truth of the drop reuniting with the ocean. And perhaps different modes of the spiritual life can and must accommodate these two different perspectives, which I'm back to sort of my favorite topic of dualism versus non-dualism.
Yes,
one
yes.
way of sort of putting a wrapper around those two different ways of thinking about reality, dualistically or non-dualistically, self, other, being fundamentally separate in some metaphysical domain versus ultimately there being only one reality, maybe with different aspects depending on circumstance. And we can think of the soul in a similar sort of way, either fundamentally separate from other souls or fundamentally united with other souls. And maybe these are just two different dialects of the spiritual life, and different people will naturally gravitate to one or the other of these dialects. I was thinking my wife and I completed about half of the Camino de Santiago this summer. And so that involved walking for a couple of 100 miles across northern Spain in various stages. And during this, we walked inside just about every church we passed, and certainly every cathedral. We went inside those churches, said prayers for friends. And then for various reasons, at the end of our trip, we took a brief trip to Switzerland and went to the Cathedral of St. Peter's in Geneva. And what really struck me was the sort of the different sorts of dialects of spirituality which I saw in the culturally Catholic region of northern Spain versus the culturally Protestant area of Geneva, and how that is reflected in the physical setup of what does the worship space look like. And inside these Catholic spaces, it was filled with things to look at. All of these, statues of the Virgin Mary and of Jesus, and all of this gold and all of these candelabra and all of this equipment to help facilitate one's relationship to the divine through a priesthood which mediates that, and it's centered in the sacrament of the Mass. And these people who you sit in the audience and you're beholding this divine panoply unfolding before you in the Mass, and you have all these beautiful things to look at and focus on, versus what I saw in the Cathedral of St. Peter in Geneva, which was, of course, originally built as a Catholic institution, but when it was converted during the Reformation, they pulled out all of the iconography, they pulled out all of the altar pieces and everything, and it left only the stone walls, and they left the beautiful stained glass. And in the Cathedral of St. Peter, there was where the altar was, and all of that stuff that would have been there in a Catholic cathedral. There was a table, a very plain table, and an open Bible sitting on the table. And it's really struck me that the difference in dialect that represents, the difference in sort of one's approach to spirituality, one of which is mediated through all of these images and through a priesthood, and the other which is it's defined by the book. Your relationship to the divine is mediated through the pages of this book. And the crazy thing is, this is the same religion. It's the same sacred scripture. It's like mostly the same doctrine. There's some differences, of course, as we all know. And this is so just within Christianity, you have these two like completely different modalities of worship, which translate to very different sorts of spaces and very different sorts of feelings when you're inside these sacred spaces. I mean, how much more is the difference in religious modalities in a mosque or a synagogue or an ashram? Somehow I think, though, behind these differences, behind these apparent differences, I remain convinced, however, that there is a common spirit that unites it. There has to be a common spirit that lies behind these different spaces. And the project of the future is not to sort of argue which one is the right one, but somehow to take what is there's a concept of an Overton window in politics, which is this it defines what the range of acceptable opinion is in the political sphere, and it's bounded to the left and to the right by the conservatives and the liberals in a society, for example. And outside that boundary is stuff you really can't say in public. And that Overton window can shift in time, to the right or to the left, external conditions and just the evolution of society and so forth. Religions strike me as being a kind of Overton window. Each religion is like a needle sharp peak within the landscape of possible belief, of theological belief. And these needle sharp peaks, which are defined by the dogmas of each religion, really don't intersect each other. And I think one way to think about the project, a spiritual project for the future, is to redefine that sort of Overton window of spirituality, so that it embraces all of these needle sharp peaks of these different religious communities, so that our understanding of acceptable expression of spirituality, acceptable, true, and valid expressions of spirituality, can embrace all of these different sorts of spiritual dialects.
I think that's I think it's important what you're saying, and when we talk about this, about intuition earlier, and what I see is that throughout history there has been a lot of doubt about religious, and in what I've read is mostly about Christianity. So it has been a lot of criticism towards the church and towards how the religious practice have been. Even in the 17th century, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of doubt. And I think often because we are focusing too much on what kind of practices we are looking at, we don't really we don't dare to have like a deeper intuition, and start to, okay, I see all the skepticism, I can see all the problems, but could there be some kind of intuition that gives us some kind of deeper spiritual co-thinking or co-being? And that's also what I started to ask does all religion have some kind of understanding of this creation, or what is the beginning and what is the end, or is there any end or beginning at all?
Yeah.
And I can't answer because I don't know every religion.
Yeah, and I guess the question of beginning and end, aside of, like assignments of time points, has something to do with purpose, right? And some sort of a like the why of existence, and I think that regardless, I mean, as Stephen so beautifully explained, this sort of complementarity of different perspectives. And I think regardless of the perspective, and you used a very interesting term, Knut, very early on, about like the universe within us. And I think that if we were to focus, and now because we're in this podcast, we're trying to think of the coming together of Athens and Jerusalem, especially in educational settings. And we learn a lot at school about the physical universe around us. Now, maybe we could use some of the elements of that universe as sort of a symbolic or analogical points to start looking at the universe within us. And I think there we could find a lot of unity between different religions and philosophical systems. And also, I mean, regardless of whether you think of yourself as an ever enduring individual or as a drop that will finally merge with the sea, I guess becoming as perfect as you can, or let's say perfecting that and developing that inner universe and that potential within you would lead to the same outcome. So I think that this might be something that we need to address much more in our educational system also. And uh, I think this would be one way in which we can bring Athens and Jerusalem together, because instead of seeing the physical universe, I know this is one of the ideas that Stephen has also elaborated very beautifully, that instead of seeing the physical universe as something separate from the metaphysical one, if you see it as a sign of it or as a symbol of it, then science can help us to become more truly human. I would say that science can help us become more spiritual.
I think that was nice, and I agree. I think there's a lot of possibilities in education that we could have changed a lot in both the topics and the content of what we are teaching in school. What one other question that I have, and that is about, because we have talked about ecology and sustainability earlier, and I wonder, these cosmological ideas that we have been discussing in this episode, what are the consequences if we think cosmological on the ecological questions? I think that maybe could be like a teaser for the next episode.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
So, okay. So thank you for listening on this episode of Athens and Jerusalem, and look forward to discuss ecology in a cosmological setting. Bye bye. You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.